only going to leave it there for now, Hilary, because we do have Environment Secretary George Eustice waiting to talk to us, and I think you were listening to that debate about vaccine and why some groups are not taking it up, and a lot of it is a question of trust. The vaccine rollout seems to be going rather well. Everyone's rather pleased with it. But there's a question of trust in certain areas, and, of course, that's been the problem for the government all the way along, hasn't it?
Yes, but as you know, your discussion, I think, has just pointed out, this has been rigorously tested through those trials. It's been gone through sort of independent processes to get the authorisation for it to be deployed. And as was pointed out, the half-life of the mRNA that goes with this vaccine is very, very small, and there are no side effects. So, I do understand that there is apprehension there. And we need to address people's concerns to make sure that they do take up this vaccine, because it is the only way we're going to get out of this particular pandemic. We do need to get all of those vulnerable groups first vaccinated and then start moving through the rest of the population so we can get back to life as normal.
The problem is you're saying that very clearly, and I can see you mean it very passionately, but we've had so many government ministers on saying the same thing at that point, and then it turns out the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, who was expounding and standing behind Boris Johnson and saying that when we didn't close down borders in March, she appeared to agree with it. Now we find out in a recorded message on a Zoom call that actually she didn't agree with that at all. She thought borders should close in March. And it looks like that the Prime Minister didn't actually listen to the person responsible for those borders. So there's a big problem with trust. Were you there at that meeting? Did you hear Priti Patel argue against it?
Look, this has been a rapidly developing situation, and we've had to respond to a new pandemic, and we're learning more about it all the time. When that original discussion took place, the advice was quite clear that it didn't make sense to close the borders since the virus was already here, and that's where it was. That would be the main driver, not through travel. So that was the advice we had at the time.
Was it? Did you hear the conversation between Priti Patel and Boris Johnson where she argued against it? So what's right? Was she listened to? Was she not listened to?
No, look, Cabinet Ministers always listen to, but there's always a discussion and there's a consensus. The consensus in March, and the advice was very clear that it wasn't, it didn't make sense to put in place a full ban on travel to close the borders. What we did do when we got into May and
George
June...
Eustice, was that a mistake, do you think? When we can look back, we look at our extraordinarily high death rate, infection rates going through the roof. Seems like that was a pretty clear mistake.
No, well, look, it is very difficult. The advice at the time was that a travel ban wouldn't have made any difference since the virus was already here and it would spread once it was here. As soon as we got the virus down and we got it under control and we came out of that first lockdown, we did actually start to introduce restrictions on travel. We did start to require,
so you realised that the consensus back there was wrong, and actually you should have gone with the individual choice that we now understand Priti Patel had. Did you agree with her at the time?
No, well, actually, I don't. Look, we followed the advice at the time. The advice at the time was that it didn't make sense to put in place a travel ban.
But we know in hindsight, don't we, George Eustice, the reality is, though...
This is the problem with the trust.
The reality is we need to be able to, as Kate said, we need to be able to trust you. So we need to be able to hear that you are looking at the same things that we're looking at, that we're hearing the Prime Minister talk about, and acknowledging that that was a mistake. We should have closed down back in March. We should have been stricter about the people coming into the country, and potentially we could have saved thousands of lives.
Well, look, the modelling that was done at the time suggested that that wouldn't be the case because the virus was here.
But we're not talking about the modelling that was done at the time. We're talking about now, all of you being able to look back and appreciate what we can see clearly as members of the public, that clearly that was a mistake.
Well, look, what you have to understand is it's very different. What we are doing now by putting in place tougher restrictions on travel, so we do require people to have a test before travelling and then to quarantine for 2 weeks. We've removed all of the exemptions. We've done that not because we think...
sorry, Mr Eustice, following the reaction to what happened back in March, you were saying there was no point closing the borders because the virus was already here. We are now 10 months into this pandemic. The virus is already here, so it's too little too late, isn't it?
No, that's what I was about to explain. The difference this time is the reason we're doing it now is because there are concerns that there could be other variants of the virus coming from other countries. So it's not about adding to the current infection rates, which are high here. It's about the risk of another variant coming in that might,
that's a
be
moot
able to
point,
evade
isn't it? Because
the
the risk of a new variant is no different from the risk of the first variant. If the control of the new variant is preventing people bringing it in, then it would have controlled the first one to bring in. So that's a slightly sort of debating society point you're making there. It's not the heart of what Ben's trying to get to, which is having a sense and trust in our government that when you look back, albeit that it was an impossible task to predict the way this pandemic was going, you admit that mistakes were made.
Well, look, as I said, it's been an incredibly difficult pandemic to manage. We've had to respond to a rapidly developing situation. We've done that. We've done so based on the evidence that we've got available to us at the time. Where we've tried things that haven't worked, such as the regional tiered system, we've moved to lockdowns. We've been, refining policy to address the challenge that we face. That's what you have to do in a dynamic, fast-moving crisis like this.
So what's in your inbox next, then? You're in charge of the environment, and that includes food. Are you looking ahead to the summer? We had incidents last summer, didn't we, where we didn't have enough people to pick crops, and that was a worry. Are we worried about food running out this summer? What are you now proving to us that you're looking ahead and planning against?
Well, our main focus of the government at the moment is to get this vaccine deployed as quickly as possible so that we can turn the corner and get back to life as normal next summer. We have taken steps to make sure that we've got labour to do the harvest, for instance. We ran a campaign last year that was successful in getting about a third of the workforce in that sector to be British people who were furloughed. That may not be necessary this time because we hope that we will have turned the corner, but we certainly will be running similar schemes again.
Do you think we'll have turned the corner? Boris Johnson seemed to think that we couldn't predict we'd be out by spring, which doesn't mean to say that life will be back to normal by the summer.
Well, it may not be back to normal, but we will be, by then, let's hope, out of the lockdown, and we will be on the road to recovery and getting back to life closer to normal. Once we start to get the vast majority of the population vaccinated, that does become an important turning point.
It is an interesting point, isn't it? Because Kate and I were here and we were covering this story. A lot of our fruit pickers come from Eastern Europe. They travel over, they are very experienced. And one of the tricky things was getting that workforce over. So what your expectation is that actually the travel corridors, quarantine when you land, all those restrictions will have been lifted. So those people that want to come from Europe to come and take part in that harvest, which is so important, will be able to do that.
Well, we anticipate that would be possible, yes, since the main period when these people come is June and July, and we know obviously this virus is quite seasonal as well. So last summer, prevalence of the virus dropped considerably over the summer, but of course anybody travelling here at that point would probably still be required, because of the ongoing risk of new variants, probably required to both have a test prior to departure and then, as we have now, to go into some form of quarantine.
Are you going to try and put people in hotels when they land? Some stories this morning pointing out that you're going to get stricter on the borders, like we've seen in Australia particularly. Anybody travelling from abroad, when they come into the country, will have to isolate, because what the problem we've had with people going into their own quarantine, they aren't being controlled to make sure they are staying there. But if we put them into hotels, or another idea is that you tag them so you can follow them, we know that they are staying in one place. Is that on the agenda?
Well, look, there's lots of speculation around at the moment about things that are being considered.
Yeah.
All I can say is there's a cabinet subcommittee that looks at all of these things on a daily basis. Everything's always kept under review. But for now, we don't think that's necessary. For now, our judgment is that if you require a pre-travel test and that becomes a condition of entry, and then you require people to quarantine, and the police have been doing a lot of spot checks on people who are supposed to be in quarantine, we think that that's sufficient for now. But we always say we rule nothing out. And if further action were needed, of course, we'd consider that.
Now, something else on your very busy patch is, of course, Storm Christoph and the devastation it's causing. So James Bevan, the head of the Environment Agency, told a group of MPs that half of the flood defences damaged last year have still not been properly fixed. We've seen the devastation it's caused, made worse by the pandemic and the fear of people leaving their homes. Did you not fix the defences last year?
Well, this isn't something I have to say that Sir James Bevan's raised with me, but it is the case that the Environment Agency have ongoing maintenance work right around the year. They've got around 6,500 staff who undertake this sort of work. And it's important to recognise as well that in this latest episode with Storm Christoph, although we had around 70 properties that were flooded, and that's devastating for those who suffered that flooding event, the measures that we had in place and the flood defences we had in place protected around 26,000 homes. So what we have done, the investments we've made do make a difference, do protect homes. But of course, it's always devastating when people do get flooded.
One last thing, if we may, and I know we've got to let you go, so we do appreciate you staying with us, is the headline that lots of people are waking up to this morning, that the government is considering paying £500 to anybody that tests positive for coronavirus, regardless of their background and their income situation, as a means of trying to get more people to self-isolate. Just 17% of people are doing that because they have fears that actually if they do test positive, they won't be able to work, they'll have no income coming into the homes. Is that something that we are going to see happen and being rolled out over the next few weeks, George Eustice?
Well, look again, this is speculation at this point. But what I would say is that at the moment we are in a full lockdown, and a lockdown is the most effective thing to start to get the prevalence of the virus under control. What we do need to start thinking about is, as we exit lockdown and people start to return to life as normal, how do we ensure that where there is an outbreak, where someone tests positive and there's a test and trace approach that reaches out to their contacts, how do we ensure that we get those people to isolate? Because one of the aggravating factors in the autumn is that people weren't, abiding by the request to self-isolate, and that
so is paying them to do that the answer?
That's a good idea.
Well, look, obviously there would be a cost associated with it. It is the case that we already make payments of £500 to those who are entitled to certain benefits, like universal credit, because we recognise that for them there is a cost to staying at home, and that's something that the government supports them with. There would be a big cost to rolling it out more widely. We don't rule anything out in this, but for now it wouldn't be needed because we're in a full lockdown. This is very much the type of thing you might consider as an exit strategy.